What's going on? This is the Saturday Down South podcast. I am Connor Guerra. Will, I think we owe the people a little explanation for not having a podcast come out at the end of last week. Fair?
Mm-hmm. A little bit.
A little bit. So basically, here's the long and short of it. And we'll try and keep this short. We have good news and bad news. The bad news, always lead with the bad news. That's the way to do it. The bad news is that unfortunately in the offseason, we will be going down to one pod a week. And we will not be doing our usual 2 pod a week throughout the year. It will be 1 pod a week basically until probably a little bit after media days. That's what we're looking at right now. The good news is that we have more, I think, buy-in and understanding from people and powers above us than we have had during probably any previous iteration of this podcast. And that is what we've had to figure out during this time. And what is positive moving forward is that we are in the process, Will and I, people that are above us, people behind the scenes, of figuring out what that looks like. And Will has been a monumental part of this. And so we have been able to essentially make our case. Why should we still do this? Because we have new ownership at Saturday Down South. For those who don't know, that changed right around the end of last season. And so we've had to change some of our objectives. But the good news is we still get to keep doing this show. And I feel more encouraged about things than I have in a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Had some great conversations with the leadership here. And, I've always said I wanted like an opportunity to compete at the highest level in all that I do. And you guys will notice I sound way different. I was just joking with Connor that me and one of my buddies, John, who I've talked about, I've mentioned him as my Ryan Grubb on this podcast. John just had a bunch of soundproofing sitting around in his basement, and we switched microphones because I was joking with Connor that, hey, if you don't like me, it needs to be because of what I say and not how I sound.
What about because of how you laugh? Is that?
Oh, my laugh, unfortunately, will only get worse now. You're going to get crispy HD, echoing off the caverns of my laughter. But yeah, so that's the thing. It's a really exciting time for ourselves and our listeners to just kind of, refocus. And we're going to be bringing some really cool interviews, some really cool content, and just excited to be here, man.
Yeah, and it's hopefully going to be it's going to be a little bit different moving forward. I'm telling the people now. We've also sort of treated you with a very lack of ad breaks. That has not been by our choice.
Oh,
That
I thought
is
you were a communist. That's good. That's news to me. I thought you didn't like capitalism. So
no. I actually do, and I like making money. So we're going to be doing things like that. But hopefully, with that is going to come more opportunities to be able to provide more different types of content. We want to be able to do live shows. We want to be able to see all of you out here in person. We want to be able to do a lot more interactive type stuff. We want to be able to have you get involved and have it actually be sponsored content that is worth our time. And that is something that during different iterations of this show, it's been a question of, is this worth our time to continue to do something just to do it? And we are still about building the audience, building a quality product. And I think for those who have listened, who have rocked with us this long, or maybe even if you just joined us this past season, you're listening because we give a crap about this. Okay. And if we didn't, and if we just hit record and just wanted to go live for an hour and just BS, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. We would have had powers above us that would have said, you're not doing this anymore.
Very true. It's 7:30 tonight. It's almost your bedtime. This man is burning the midnight oil for you, the listener. You're getting late night will. I'm sorry, guys.
Hey, all my parent friends, you guys get it. It was President's Day. We had we had Claire home from daycare, so we're working on a different type of schedule during the day. But we're in a good place. And the good news about this is that while it is one less pod, there are going to be more opportunities for sponsorships and stuff like that. We're going to still continue to do great content. We're going to continue to do even better content, in my opinion. So that's what we're going to start with today. We have a great show lined up for the people. We have Derek Peterson, our guy, coming up in a bit, talk to Oklahoma, early Heisman bets, whether or not to, wait for it, whether or not to buy LSU stock.
Oh, gosh, here we go.
Yeah, get ready. Ride the roller coaster. And then we're going to end with Lad of the Week. So along those lines, I thought, you know what? Now would be a really fitting time to look at what we know halfway through the 2020s. I don't mean to Sunday scary some people that are listening to this, but we are officially, at least in college football terms, halfway through the 2020s. 5 seasons down, 5 seasons to go. And why not just take a look at it retrospectively? Let's look back on the decade that was, things that maybe we didn't know coming into the 2020s, things that we have since figured out, things that are still kind of a question mark moving forward. We've been talking a lot of big picture internally lately. Let's talk some big picture with college football. So this is just what we know halfway through the 2020s. I feel like this decade of college football has gone by at 1.5 speed compared to the 2010s.
Yes, absolutely. It's so crazy, right? It's such a microcosm of everything that's happened. Because you look back 5 years ago and it feels like COVID was just the other day. But then you see some of like the humor and the TikTok stuff and the trends that happened. And it's like, gosh, that feels like it was 20 years ago. And kind of the same thing, right? You look back at the 2020 season and it was the beginning of so many things, right? That was kind of the beginning of the NIL era. We saw the Bo Nix, Milo's deal, stuff like that.
Mm.
And it was honestly kind of scary as the season was with the lack of fans and everything, it felt like a new positive era because all the NIL stuff, like the Life Wallet stuff, hadn't quite happened yet. It feels like these are all just some kids. DeColdest Crawford was getting his AC deal.
Who could forget?
Like it felt like college football was kind of on this precipice. And what's happened since then, as these things often do, as it's been all over the place. And so to your point, it's like on the daily, it's been a grind. But then you look back at the macro and you're like, goodness, 2020 feels like forever ago.
It really does. So let's start there with what we know, because we know that conferences are truly independent entities. That is what 2020 established in so many ways. The beginning of the 2020s was the COVID season. That was, let's be honest, just a year that was very much in jeopardy. We didn't know if they were going to actually play football for the longest time, and it seemed like some conferences were going to do this and other conferences were going to do that. We had the alliance. Rest in peace to that. I'll never forget it. The Big Ten, the Pac 12, the ACC, they acted out of their own best interest to form what they ultimately believed was going to be a united front moving forward. And then the Big Ten went rogue, as it did throughout that process, because that's just who Kevin Warren was. And yeah, that's what we learned. Conferences are going to do what conferences are going to do. They're going to do things that are going to just benefit their bottom dollar. And once you understand that, it allows you to understand why college football is the way that it is and why 2020 unfolded the way that it did. And it was sort of really a time, not a time that I like looking back on fondly, but a time that really forecasted, that's the wrong word, foreshadowed the rest of the 2020s.
Mhm.
Conferences are independent. They do not act in hopes that the good of the sport is going to be kept in mind, which we saw really from the way that everything unfolded with the Pac 12 as well. Pac 12 died. The other conferences basically went to the Pac 12 to sort of pick it apart. I don't want to call it vulturing, because I think vultures aren't murderers. They pick at the carcass when it's
Mhm.
already dead. And the Big Ten sort of was delivered the knockout blow. That's probably a better way to say it. And the Big 12 was a little bit more the vulture, I guess,
Yep.
um, in that process.
You
But
know what's funny too? You mentioned the ACC as part of the alliance, and I had forgotten they were part of the alliance. Or it's easy to forget that because if you take a snapshot of 2020 with Kevin Warren, and he's sitting there talking about we got to protect these student athletes. We don't want to play because of COVID. We care about academics, so we only expand in a certain way.
hot
And then in
garbage.
about 6 months, maybe even 3 months, all of that was washed away because again, the ACC was in quote unquote the alliance with them. They could have gone after UNC or Duke or whoever in the ACC, and they didn't. They went straight to the Pac-12. They went straight out west to destroy their footprint. And I'm not going to speak on the quality of education at some of these places, but let's say that the Michigan alums that were upset about Nebraska could have been equally as upset about some of these other universities. So it's funny that the decade started with the Big Ten taking this big moral stand, and it took less than half a year for them to just light all of that on fire.
Yeah, and the whole like, hey, we got to look out for the health and well-being of our
For the
athletes.
sport. Yep, and the athletes.
Entirely changes when everybody else is playing football, and then you realize very quickly, oh, the Big Ten would probably play football right now if
Mhm.
everybody else was playing in a pit of lava and you got burned with every step that you took. That was just what we saw, and now all the cards are on the table. Let's not try and hide it, and that's what the beginning of the decade was all about. We know that the SEC drove the conference realignment conversation. That was a huge, huge development early in the decade because Oklahoma and Texas, they were the ultimate heist. The SEC did the unthinkable. Everybody remembers what that was like in 2021, being there at SEC Media Days as this is all breaking. And you're like, wait a minute, is this an onion story? What in the world is going on in college football? And then what happens afterwards is the Big Ten and the Pac and the Big Ten and the Big 12 pivoted extremely well off of those moves, but that's what they were. They pivoted off of those moves, and those moves basically led to the death of the Pac 12, while the ACC's grant of rights deal, as it turned out, pretty ironclad. We know that halfway through the
Mhm.
decade. Grant of rights confirmed airtight. I think we could all say with certainty.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, and actually, I'll go back on my last point a little bit because exactly what you just said. FSU has been trying to claw their way out of that grant of rights deal this entire time. I feel like everything that we know to be real in college football has been tested. And I am going to give a nod to your point to Brett Yormark, the Big 12 commissioner.
For
I
sure.
think that the way, it's one thing to pivot when you're kind of in Greg Sankey, and I think Greg Sankey has handled this better than any commissioner. I think he's far and away the best commissioner in college sports. But I think Yormark's number two. And I think there's a pretty big gap between Yormark and number three because the way that they didn't, they kept moving. They pivoted to be a basketball conference in the Big 12. And I think that's worked out great for them.
And a good football conference, too.
Yeah.
Still a good football conference, even though with some of the stuff that we'll get to later, they could be very much in that second tier and not in the first tier that they would love to be in, but the results just don't bear it out. We also know that Texas could actually be back without it being shouted into our eardrums on a Sunday night in September. I like Joe Tess. I really do. I do. I take some shots at Joe Tess. If we for whatever reason have never had him on the show, at some point, well, I'm sure we'll be able to line that up. I do like Joe Tess, but that call is to me just infamous and very much synonymous with the 2010s. Sark stepping in the way that he did after the 2020 season very much had, I think, the college football world questioning, is Texas more a dead end job than a sleeping giant? Because the second post Mac Brown coach failed, Tom Herman, the guy who couldn't fail, the guy that
Right.
was so coveted during that cycle in 2017 that everybody's looking at going, guys, this is the guy. He's been groomed. He even took the job at Houston for a couple years and did what he did there. This is going to work. And then, as we know, it ultimately didn't. And I question definitely, and I questioned as recently as a year and a half ago, if Texas would truly ever return to prominence, or if we'd forever just talk about how it basically had one title post integration, but it was such an awesome title that you couldn't stop talking about it. I mean,
Yep.
that's reality. Maybe that will still be the case when we look back on this 50 years from now, but right now it doesn't feel like it, because when you reach consecutive playoff semifinals like Texas did, you could make the case that it's got its most optimism in the last 2 decades, thanks to Sark.
Yeah, and it's crazy when you think about Charlie Strong and we think about Tom Herman. These are two guys that had the pedigree, that had Strong coming from Florida with that kind of like, I don't want to call it a dynasty because it wasn't as it wasn't long, but a really well respected coach. The coach is still respected today.
One of the most established, respected coordinators in the sport when he took the Texas job.
Absolutely. So that was a guy that, couldn't fail, but then Herman even more so, right? He was the Billy Napier of his cycle. He was the young offensive hotshot that looked cool. He was kind of the second coming of Cliff Kingsbury. And it felt like I remember LSU went after him and couldn't get him. And I remember feeling, hopeless at that time that LSU had ended up with Coach O, which obviously, both of them have different stories. But then you have Sark, who had just come out of the, Nick Saban PR, rehabilitation, where it was like, okay, Saban has this history of taking these guys in, putting a stamp of approval on them. And, with him, with Lane Kiffin, it was seen like the next job, Texas, Ole Miss had seen that they were taking a chance on this guy. And that chance has paid off in spades for Texas.
Well, I think Tom Herman was in a different class than Billy in his cycle. I remember that feeling very significant, that he was taking the step up job from that 2014 season at Ohio State on. It was kind of, all right,
Yeah.
where's Tom Herman going to end up? It's inevitable. Whereas Billy Napier, I think the spectrum was just greater than it was for Tom Herman. At one point, I'm thinking Billy Napier is going to take the South Carolina job. Maybe that's going to make the most sense for him. And then ultimately he ends up getting still a really good job. But I think he was held in even higher regard. And I don't know how many coaches in the playoff era were considered as can't miss as Tom Herman was.
Yep.
I mean, think about that, man. Like in terms of guys that were truly high during the playoff era, he's got to be up there. Maybe that's a list that I got to do another time and try and really
Kirby
put
Smart
myself
is
in
the
that
only
moment.
one that feels right there. Georgia guy coming from
Sure.
Alabama, had also talked to South Carolina. Like, because Herman was telling teams no. That was what was so weird about him, is that he was like actually on The Bachelor for college football.
Yeah. The only thing I would say with Kirby that I even push back, this guy's never been a head coach.
Yeah.
I saw Muschamp. I saw how that worked out when the Saban disciple who hadn't been a head coach gets the big time job, and then look what happened. There was still that little piece with Kirby early on, and even first season. Herman was among the most can't miss, and then ultimately, go figure that this is how cyclical the sport is. Sark kind of has his fall and then his rise again by the end of the 2010s, and ultimately we know what he is now.
Mhm.
We know that Clemson did not adapt soon enough. Now, there's a caveat there. We are adapt or die guys. That's one of the things that I think we're going to try and be with what we're doing with our show moving forward. If there's a team that you can criticize for not embracing adapt or die, it is obviously Clemson because we see the differences. In the 2020s decade, Clemson doesn't have a playoff victory and it has 4 consecutive finishes outside of the AP top 10. It was a decade that began with number one ranking going into that 2020 COVID season. And that's after the title game trips in 4 of the previous 5 years to end the 2010s. Is it entirely just Dabo's lack of use of the transfer portal? No. Is it a significant factor for a team that is really now feeling like for the first time it has a proven elite quarterback with perhaps an elite defense? Yes. And I think that's where it hasn't necessarily lined up. And you're going to see people that are more bullish on Clemson now, and not just because they got 3 guys out of the portal this cycle. But it is an adapt or die era, maybe as much as any that we've seen in the history of the sport with the amount of changes. And Clemson has been the team that has not fully gone all in with it. And I think, look, it was fair to wonder coming into the 2020s if Clemson was going to become the team of the decade, a discussion that we're going to get to in a very short matter here. But if you had told anyone that Saban's going to step down in the front half of the decade, Clemson would have been the most obvious next dynasty up with how well they finished in the latter half of the 2010s.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here looking at their bowl history, hence, the typing. And it's funny because winning the Cheez It Bowl is kind of their highlight from this decade, huh? In terms of an end of season.
ACC
I'm
championship against SMU to get into the playoff is it. Well, that, you know what?
But an ACC championship against
Or
SMU.
the ACC redemption game against Notre Dame in 2020, the COVID season where Trevor Lawrence didn't play in the first game, he gets to play in the second game. That's probably their truly their best moment of the 2020s, which is telling.
You put me in a classic fork in the road here where I got to talk about Brian Kelly and big games, and I won't do it. I'm going to talk about the Cheez It Bowl here. No, just kidding. I mean, yeah, they've won the Cheez It Bowl and the Gator Bowl. They lost the most orange bowl of all time, as
Mhm.
you'll remember. And again, going back 5 years, looking at Josh Heupel, who was at UCF right there, and he was seen as the guy at UCF who couldn't win the big game, couldn't beat Cincinnati. You know what I'm saying? And now this is a guy who pretty convincingly beats Dabo. If you had said that had happened in 5 years, that not don't worry about hiring Heupel. That's a whole different thing. Saying, hey, Heupel's at Tennessee. Well, how's this going to go? It's like Dabo's the big game guy. He's got the athletes. He's going to blow this team off the field. They got that gimmicky offense at Tennessee. So yeah, or Heupel does rather. So yeah, I mean that's actually kind of a really good microcosm. Is that yeah, you could argue they've gotten to the big stage, right? They got to the CFP last year, but once they saw a team that was truly an elite team, they looked outmatched.
And the thing is with Clemson, they answered the early question of what's it going to look like post Deshaun Watson. Was it just this unbelievable team that had the right quarterback at the right time that could truly go toe to toe with Bama and stare him in the face in consecutive years? And then they answered that by having Trevor Lawrence. So you thought, and I definitely thought, Clemson's out of the woods. They're good. They're now recruiting better than they ever have before.
Uyunglele had the greatest game. It was a reminiscent game of one of those great quarterbacks against Notre Dame, right in the first game, without Trevor Lawrence. And so, point being, like, I think that I think that that was a moment of like, oh well, yeah, they still got this guy Uyunglele. He's going to be great for a couple of years, and look at him now, still in the
Yeah.
SEC.
Still, yeah, still doing it. But yeah, that is clearly, I think, a takeaway from watching the way that it has played out, how night and day it's been for Clemson latter half of the 2010s compared to the first half of the 2020s. We know that the team of the decade so far is Georgia. Not just the 2 titles, 5 top 7 finishes, 3 top 4 finishes. Ohio State also had 3 top 4 finishes. We're talking AP poll kids, but just the 1 title for Ohio State. And of course, it lost the only head to head with Georgia, a game that many people remember. Maybe one of the best games of the 2020s as well. That Peach Bowl game I was at that was just truly unbelievable, that comeback from Georgia. Michigan also had the 3 top 4 finishes, but also just the 1 title, and then lost the head to head to Georgia, of course. Another game I was at that was definitely not one of the best games of the decade. Alabama might have the best case for best individual team of the 2020s, that 2020 Bama team. Going unbeaten, the all SEC schedule, the Devontae Smith Heisman season, 2 dominant playoff wins. I mean, nobody was really close to Bama. Florida having a relatively close game against Bama, even though I don't know that Florida ever led in that game in the SEC championship. That was considered a win for Florida in some ways. Like,
Yeah, that's taken me out of my host role, and that's putting back on the fan hater hat where I was like, well, they never had a chance. They kept scoring, but they were never leading in that game, and that was my way of looking at it. And I don't even think I was right necessarily because the things that have happened since then with Florida administration, but it made me feel like Dan Mullen wasn't going to get there. I feel like he's been vindicated, like we talked about in one of the last pods. But yeah, you're right. Alabama felt like they were unbeatable, and I will say, as a nod to a recent pod as well, I think that the NFL players on Georgia's roster for those back-to-back titles growing up has like I could feel the Georgia fans saying, "Oh, COVID season, our players." Da, da, da. I would love to see those two teams play.
Jim Dunaway and I had this debate. I would still take 2021 Georgia over 2020 Bama in
Hmm.
my against the aliens save the
Yep.
earth type game, just because I wouldn't want to have any sort of questions whatsoever. And I think 2021 Georgia ended up having fewer questions. And not to take away from Bama, because I just put them in that conversation. This past season, if we're still talking about the team of the decade, this past season is probably going to loom large for Bama in that argument. At least at the halfway mark. We'll see how it plays out with these next 5 years. But I think if you win 3 titles in a decade, you've all but locked in team of the decade status. It's really tough to top that if you can do that within one individual decade. Go back to the last 5 decades, and please don't be drinking every time I say the word decade. It's starting to sound weird. I'm saying it so often. 1980s, Miami, 3 titles. 1990s, Nebraska, 3 titles, which slightly, ever so slightly trumps FSU's 2 national titles with 10 consecutive top 4 finishes. One of the best feats of the post integration era of college football. 2000s, murky, really murky, because USC, Florida, and LSU all won 2 titles and nobody got to 3. Maybe USC has the tiebreaker because it has the 7 consecutive top 4 finishes from '02 to '08. USC is considered the dynasty of that era, whereas those 2 LSU national champions are with 2 different coaches, which is probably more a credit to the program itself. But I think you could at least make that case a little bit differently for those other programs. It's not as clear cut because nobody got to that 3rd title, and by the end of the decade, USC was dealing with probation. So
And you know
that
what's
we know.
funny too is that you could go through and say, okay, USC has the weird situation with the Heisman, the AP title, all that. LSU is a 2-loss season, which used to mean something. We used to take that out of the conversation. Now it's like, hey, 2-loss season, come on down.
Sure.
And so, yeah, both of those teams felt very tumultuous throughout the decade as well. USC losing Pete Carroll, LSU losing their minds for a minute there. And so, yeah, I think that Alabama kind of swooping in at the end of the decade and playing as dominantly as they did, and to your point, Florida too. It's like there was turmoil on both sides of that. So I mean, honestly, like Bama fans could get in here and make the case of, well, the Saban thing started in the 2000s and it was stability and Go ahead.
Bama's the team of the 2010s, though.
Oh, there's no
Clearly.
question there. There's no question there. But you know what I'm saying? Like with Florida, it was very up and then it was very down, but it did very clearly cap off at 2010. So I think I'd go ahead and give that to Florida.
Florida over USC. Interesting.
I think so because at the end of the day, Florida, they're both such short runs. That's what's so weird about it is there's not any like me and my buddy always go back and forth about dynasties. It's something that I'm fascinated by, and like I said at the top of the pod, I don't consider either of those a dynasty because they never really truly had to reload. Like Florida didn't have to really get past Tim Tebow, you know.
Yeah, is how much of it is reloading versus doing it with the same cast and crew, but
Hmm.
maybe, different quarterback or something like that. It is all up to interpretation for that. But yeah, if Georgia gets to 3 titles, if that happens once in the next 5 years, I think team of the decade will be all but locked for Georgia. We know that the Heisman isn't just a quarterback award anymore. After we had one non-quarterback win the award in the 2010s, two of the first 5 winners of the 2020s, non-quarterbacks. That's also as many non-quarterback winners as we had in the 2000s. It won't be like the 90s, okay, when we had 6 non-quarterbacks win. That was probably too many, if
Hmm.
we're being honest, but maybe it's somewhere in between, which is probably how it should be. Also, go listen to our non-quarterback Heisman draft pod that we just did. There's a reason why we talk about this stuff, because it's very topical.
Yeah, absolutely. And that one was, of course, Mark Ingram, one of the kind of beginning of the Alabama run, and that was a weird Heisman year, if I remember correctly. That was like the Toby Gerhart year, and so yeah, I think that it was very interesting because we always like to tell ourselves these stories about how things are going to go. Because remember, he was one of the first underclassmen to win the award, if I remember that correctly, and then Johnny Manziel and Jameis Winston kind of came after him. Um,
'07 Tebow was the first sophomore. I know Arkansas fans. It should have been Darren McFadden the year earlier.
mhm.
I get it. I get it. We all agree.
No, you're right. Actually, good point. It was Tebow and then Ingram. And then, yeah, so like that kind of broke that little glass ceiling where voters started being like, oh, wait, actually, this doesn't matter. It's more impressive if a guy
Tebow, Bradford, then Ingram.
was Bradford. Yeah, because Bradford came back. No, but I think Bradford came back first. Anyway, that was like how it was discussed at the time. It completely changed the Heisman and it turned into, this is like a quarterback award. And then to your point, it swung back around.
Yeah, definitely, very much, and it is. I think hopefully getting back to a place of a little bit more of a deeper understanding of how we evaluate these positions. We know that there's not a clear winner for best individual season of the 2020s. Maybe you'll disagree with this. I would argue that 2023 Jaden Daniels, 2021 Will Anderson, and 2020 Devontae Smith, I think they have the best case so far for best individual season. And then in tier 2, I would put like 2024 Travis Hunter, 2024 Ashton Genty, and then 2021 Bryce Young. I wouldn't even put 2022 Caleb Williams quite in that group. I'd put that as like a tier 3 type Heisman. Maybe I'd throw in 2021 Jordan Davis, but you'd probably get pushback on the fact that Georgia, as we mentioned, 7 first rounders eventually on that defense. A little bit tougher to make the case. I don't think 2022 Stetson Bennett would win that argument either. Do we really think he's the best? He had the best individual season of anybody during this 5-year stretch. I wouldn't go that far. But I would say that the title is very much still up for grabs. And it would not surprise me if we end the decade with that being decided at some point, 2025 through 2029.
Yeah, and look, the best part about Saban being gone is I can be nice to Bama guys now because I'm totally with you on Will Anderson, right? Like this is a guy that you were on him from the jump as far as wow, this is one of like best pass rusher. Like, I mean, and we talked about Bama has basically unbreakable pass rusher records. And like south of that, he was the best that could possibly be in the amount of time he was there in the modern era, all that different stuff. And I think that kind of having the season where he came back and we talked about this in the non QB draft, how people kind of just get over the media conversation. They start talking about other stuff. Will Anderson has never played bad football pretty much in his life that I remember. Maybe he had an off game here or there where he kind of was double blocked,
Dude,
but
even 2020, he was lights out as a true
yeah.
freshman that year.
Yeah. So like that's the thing. Like that's a guy that I feel like in the NFL, he's gonna get better and better and better every year. And we're gonna look back and be like, look, we tried to tell you guys in 2021 that this guy was one of the best players we've ever seen. And to your point, they kind of split the vote, right? Having
Aiden Hutchinson, yeah.
yeah. But having him and Bryce on the same team, having Aiden Hutchinson, all that different stuff. So many things outside of his control. There was no truly dominant Bama team that he was a part of. He wouldn't even get like the Jonathan Allen type buzz where it was like, you're the leader of this team because they had Bryce Young. So point being, yeah, I just think he was actually kind of underrated. So I love that. Obviously, JD number one. Defense was trash. Easy way to explain that. They would have won 5 or 6 games, and everyone would have been really laughing at Brian Kelly. Jokes on everyone else. And then, yeah, Devontae Smith. I mean, a guy, same deal. Every year in the NFL, he's getting a little bit better. It was seen at the time as kind of a weird Heisman because receivers so rarely win it. But you see, there's a guy that just had an impactful. He was Bama's first touchdown scorer in a Super Bowl. So, like, again, kind of properly rated with the Heisman.
Will Anderson had 34 and a half TFLs that year. 34 and a half TFLs. No
Mm.
Heisman invite. Whatever. We know that coaching trends are going to be well, I don't want to say they're going to be. They're currently extremely weird.
Hmm.
That's really all that I can come to. And here's when you kind of put it all in perspective, this makes sense. Or at least it doesn't make sense. Oklahoma and Notre Dame watched their coaches bolt. The best coach in the history of the sport retired. All right. The best coach in the history of the pro sport came back to the college game. A guy won a title and walked off back to the NFL. A guy lost a game that would have gotten him fired in any other year in the history of the sport. And then because it wasn't one of those years, he had to win a champ. He basically had to win a championship to keep his job, and he did, or at least he had to do what he did to get to a national championship game, and that happened. A $76 million buyout was paid to a coach who was trending up when he entered the decade, and now he can't find work. Half the SEC has coaches in the $9 million club, and it's only a matter of time before we see half the conference enter the $10 million club. What else is there? Oh, yeah. Deion Sanders took the Colorado job and then led that program to an AP Top 25 finish in year 2. Scott Frost not only never coached a bowl game at Nebraska, but he returned to UCF. Rich Rod is back at West Virginia.
Connor, did I tell you what we're doing for my birthday this year?
The fact that you perked up when I said Scott Frost makes me think it's something related to that, and that terrifies me.
September 20th, Orlando, Florida. Bill Belichick versus Scott Frost.
Is that game on the CW?
It better be on ABC, buddy, because there's going to be like 10,000 people in the stadium and all of America tuning in online.
Tom Brenneman on the call?
Oh, that would be fire.
Hopefully not. That'll make the YouTube TV multi-view, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Probably.
Tom Brenneman's going to be like, look, see, guys deserve second chances. I'm trying to tell you. Look.
Everybody gets a second chance. Everybody here that you're seeing has gotten a second chance. Give me one, too. We know that the worst hire of the decade was Brian Harsin. It's Brian Harsin, man. Jimmy Lake deserves a mention here because of what Washington was before and what Washington was after with Kalen DeBoer. But strictly of the 2020s, Brian Harsin, worst hire. Doomed from the start. And you could say maybe that's not all on him, but a hire is about alignment, and that was just never the case from the jump. 9-12 overall, 4-9 against the SEC. He set recruiting back. He upset boosters with his lack of buy-in. He didn't go to Bo Jackson's thing. He didn't go to this or that. Tries to troll Auburn at every chance he gets. Now, that's the part that you're just like, buddy, Auburn did you a solid in the end, because while it was a desperation hire that clearly not everyone in that building wanted, a post year 1 coup and then the buyout that he was paid, the guy, look, for people that feel bad for Brian Harsin, this is going to make you not feel bad. Okay. He ended up getting around $25 million from Auburn to win 4 SEC games, $6 million per SEC win, nearly $3 million per any win if we want to go full Ravel. Doing that less than 2 years after a program agreed to pay what was then the richest buyout ever for a college football coach, that lets you know you were bad. Worst hire of the 2020s. I don't know that that'll be topped in the latter half of the decade.
Yeah, man, it's so hard to argue against that because everyone that I'm thinking of was hired like before and fired during. I think Deshaun Foster from UCLA kind of will see. Like, I just doesn't look like the job is. But you're right, the expectations aren't there.
So
like,
low, and the money's
right.
going to be different than what it was at Auburn.
You're right. I think like I'm just looking up and down, like kind of like the hot seat list here. It's like, yeah, but no job as I mean, again, big jobs made mistakes before 2020, right? We could talk about our boy, what's his name at Arkansas? That we always
Chad Morris is the worst hire of the 21st century.
Yeah, but that was before.
Harsin wouldn't. Yeah, Harsin, I don't think you could say it was worse than Chad Morris, but Chad Morris is the gold standard for a bad hire. Never won an SEC game in 2 years.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty. Yeah, and I mean I don't know. The Michigan State situation was just kind of a tough situation all around, so it's hard to like evaluate that. But Harsin was bad, man. I mean, and the fact that he came so close to winning a couple of these big games, like primarily the Bama game, I think that it's just Auburn was seen as this very like recession-proof, lucky football team, and they're just kind of listless after even hiring an established coach.
Mel Tucker was fired with cause. They didn't have to worry about the buyout, man.
That's a good point. Yeah, if you're fired with cause, it doesn't count anymore.
They wanted to fire Harsin with cause. They couldn't find a way to do that, and then they're like, screw it, we'll just pay him. That's a bad hire. That's
can't do that.
Yeah. We know that the master plan for the playoff was never just 4 or 12. Ross Dellinger broke that news this week. More momentum than ever for playoff expansion in 2026. Something we've been talking about for a while. 14 or 16 teams, the Big Ten and SEC are meeting again. basically to kind of lay this all out and kind of looks like finalize what the plan is going to be moving forward. And it's looking like they're going to get 4 auto bids apiece, and it's going to be their world and everyone else is living in it. That's really what this all comes down to. They're acting out of their own best interest, but their own best interest is to unite. Call it the Alliance 2.0, call it the Alliance 3.0, whatever it is. It's looking like we're going to get increased playoff contracts with a Big Ten SEC challenge every year, which is why that contract, I guess, isn't so much a increased playoff contract. It's more of just an increased contract overall. We're hopefully going to get this 9-game SEC schedule that everybody's been banging the drum for forever, a restructuring of conference championship weekend so that conferences can basically lose those, but still reap the financial rewards of the expanded field and playoff representation guarantees, all those different things. This was never going to be about what's for the good of the sport. And I know for the purists, for the Josh Pates of the world, for the Ari Wassermans, my guys, like I fully get the fight that they continue to fight. But there's a reason you don't hear me talk about that so often on this show, because it is punching air.
Hmm.
Okay. It truly, truly is. At a certain point, it was punching air. And much like with NIL and the soon to be revenue sharing model, we'll wait and see what the House settlement looks like, in April, if we're going to, see a new era of college football yet again. Um, Look, we know that this was always going to be about the richest schools finding ways to get richer so that they can cover their ever increasing budgets for all of this. And that's what this comes down to. It's really, you can make this complicated or you can accept how simple that is and you could dislike it. That's fine. But we also know that we're all still here, no matter how much everything continues to change. And that's probably what's most important for today's discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I've often said that 6 or 8 would be the perfect number, and again, to your point, no one's listening to me. I need to have a couple of Billies with a B. If you got a couple Millies, you can't even get in the door to discuss this with people. So that's not for regular people like us. That's the best part, is that there truly is no action item. That's correct perspective. It's that we could be old man yells at cloud, but the wheels of this machine are moving with or without us because they're happening in rooms we're not invited to. You know what I'm saying? We could talk about that. We could talk about how NIL is going to be, that's the most interesting part of this to me, because playoff expansion, to your point, isn't that interesting. It's just going to be bigger and bigger until there is some type of revolt that stops it, right? That's what the NFL is doing. They're going to a longer season. It's every last dollar in gate revenue you can get. So NIL is going to be really interesting. But I will say, on the plus side of all that news, we got college football video games back.
Great point, Will. We know that there was finally a resolution to the question that I think if we're being honest, it plagued a lot of the love of the sport during the 2010s. To see that taken away, why it was taken away, and ultimately why it came back when it came back the way that it did, ironically enough, coincided with fans being frustrated about NIL, about the ever increasing costs that this sport demands. And really, there is still joy to be gained from it. And it's tough to see through the weeds, but you did a good job of seeing through the weeds right there, because that's something I probably should have brought up. Yeah. College football 25, 26 is coming out really soon, isn't it?
Hmm.
This
Yeah.
summer, right?
Yeah, it was media days when the last one came out, and the beauty of, as we've discussed, no one loss should ever define your season. We saw plenty of college football coaches upset, feeling like they got the short end of the stick, therefore proving they always would have felt that about something, because Ohio State can lose to Michigan. They cannot play in their conference championship game, and yet they can win a natty, and all their friends can say, "Ha ha, none of that mattered." And so I think at the end of the day, it does mean that your team is never truly dead until they lose that third game, or they lose in a playoff format. Whereas, like, I remember where I was when LSU lost each of those games in 2007 as a child. I couldn't focus in school. Now it's like, all right, well, I think I got a Zoom meeting at 10:30. I might as well get to that because next week's a new week.
Is 2020 the 2020s decade, is it easier overall on our mental health in some ways?
I
Yes.
think if we take out the first 2 years, I could agree with that. I think if we started 2022, I'd get behind that.
Yeah. A lot of tough moments still. First part of the decade with the 14 playoffs still. A lot of
Mhm.
very costly losses. I shouldn't probably sweep with too broad of a brush there. But yeah, that's the 2020s so far. We are officially halfway through. All right, let's kick it to Derek Peterson. Great stuff from our guy who graduated from Oklahoma, knows the program very, very well, but covers all things college football for us at SDS. So here's Derek. Now excited to be joined by a very special guest. It is our own Derek Peterson. Derek, let's start with a painful subject. We haven't talked on air since we were chatting at SEC Media Days, which you were there. You were there for that whole experience, the Oklahoma Texas migration to the SEC. But what word best describes the 2024 Oklahoma offense?
Yuck. Um, Never again. That's two words. It was bad. I mean, I could be super mean, or I could just, be very blunt. It was bad, unacceptable, maybe. Um,
Putrid?
yeah, yuck. Yuck is the first one that comes to mind. But like, especially at a place like Oklahoma, unacceptable is it's pretty apt. Like when they made the move from Lincoln Riley to Brent Venables, a lot of the subtext around that move, obviously they didn't like push Lincoln Riley out the door, but you know what I mean? The subtext behind that move was we're switching from this guy that is known as this glamorous quarterback guru, big offense, lots of scoring, lots of yardage, doesn't know how to coach defense, doesn't know how to put a good defense on the field. Now we're going to go to Brent Venables, who for years and years and years at Clemson was regarded as one of, if not the best defensive minds in the game. And what were his defenses known for? Physicality. We're going to pivot from this glamorous era to being physical. And OU was really good on defense last year, and really, really bad on offense. And so, I think the physicality was there to an extent, certainly with the defense, but then with the offense, you talk about just their complete inability to move the ball down the field. You talk about their complete inability to block. Injuries played a huge part. They were absolutely decimated on the offensive line and in the receiver room. But at the same time, like there just wasn't anywhere close to enough efficiency or explosiveness from the offense. It was really jarring to see because for, the better part of my adult life, I've known Oklahoma as this team that can just put points on the board whenever it wants.
If OU had experienced the depletion factor where it loses the 5 receivers before the calendar turns October, 8 different offensive line rotations from a group that was brand new coming into the season anyways. If they experience that while still in the Big 12, are they 8-4? Are they 9-3? Is that too much of a leap, or is this was always going to be the path no matter what conference they were
in? I mean, the SEC separates the boys from the men to an extent, so it probably wouldn't have been as jarring. It wouldn't have been as yucky if they were still in the Big 12. But I still think they would have had issues. You think about who the top teams in the Big 12 were last year, and those teams would have given Oklahoma issues. I mean, like you look at like Utah, which was awful last year for in a lot of the same ways. Like Utah was an outstanding defense last year, and they still were stinky as a team overall. They probably would have given OU trouble. So I think I said to you in the SEC Media Day stuff that we did that I thought OU was going to be like a 6 or a 7 win team just because of all the change, just because we had questions about the offensive line coming into the season. I had questions about what they were going to be able to do from a passing game standpoint coming into the season. And I don't think anybody could have predicted the sheer degree to which they were decimated by injuries. But it was certainly a transition year in a lot of regards, and then the injuries just made it really, really difficult to navigate.
What do you think of Venables copying the Vandy model of getting a package deal with the OC and the quarterback by adding Ben Arbuckle and John Mateer, a move that feels like it's ultimately going to define his tenure in Norman?
Yeah, well, and it's not even just those two guys. They also brought Washington State's quarterbacks coach, who's going to be an analyst and an assistant quarterbacks coach for Oklahoma. So and I think it's really fascinating when you take that, like they picked up the passing game from Washington State and they moved it to Norman. When you take that in conjunction with Brent Venables coming out and saying that he's going to be calling the plays for the defense next season, it becomes really fascinating. This is obviously a make or break year for Brent Venables. If they are bad again, if they're yucky again, he doesn't get a fourth year. It's just, were we going into year 4? We're going into year 4. He
Yeah,
doesn't get a fifth
year
year.
5. Yeah.
He doesn't get a fifth year, excuse me. Doesn't get another year. These all run together. He's in a conversation with John Blake, which, like, if you're in Oklahoma football, like, you never want to be in a conversation with John Blake. And so, when he came out and announced that he was going to be taking over defensive play calling, like, my thought was like, okay, this is going to be just Washington State's offense. This is entirely Ben Arbuckle gets carte blanche to do what he wants. And I think that can actually help John Mateer quite a bit, because there's going to be so much familiarity. There's going to be so much carryover. The expectations aren't going to be to learn new stuff. The expectation is going to be just do what you did, man. We want you. We want what you did. We want what you can do. Just do what you did, man. Just do it. The level of competition is going to be greater. But I think John Mateer is, top 4 or 5 quarterback in the SEC before we even see him play it down in the SEC.
Wow.
I think he's really good. And in Arbuckle's offense, and assuming Oklahoma can have some health on the offensive line and a little bit of positive development on the offensive line, I think he can be really, really good. And they're going to have a high floor because the defense should be good again, because they have the pieces of an outstanding front seven, even in spite of, losing some big name guys. I think the floor that the defense will provide will be relatively high. And so, it just becomes like, can Mateer scale it? Like, can he do what he did against the competition that Washington State played last year? Can he do that against the SEC defenses that he's going to face? And there's probably going to be, some bumps in the road. PFF tracked 17 turnover-worthy plays last year, which was more than what Michael Hawkins and Jackson Arnold had combined on their pass attempts. He only threw 7 interceptions on those. I think it's 17. We got it? Yeah, 17. Yeah, 17. He only threw 7 interceptions. So he got a little lucky in that regard. He's going to need to be a little bit safer with the football. But what he provides from a running standpoint, and what Ben Arbuckle kind of lets him do from sort of a play creation standpoint, throwing off platform, throwing on the run, creating things after the initial breaks down, that can sort of help mitigate what have been OU issues. Like, if the offensive line continues to be an issue, like, he can do things that Jackson Arnold can't, which is kind of why you saw OU move to Michael Hawkins last year.
Yep.
And Hawkins is a little Mateer light, but he's just not anywhere close to where Mateer's at in his development. And so now you've added this guy who should walk in the door and immediately feel a level of comfort, a level of confidence, and a level of familiarity with what's going on around him, because, like we said, you just picked up this offense and you just imported it into Norman.
Derek, I'm not as bullish on Mateer, because not just he had one season and it was against Mountain West competition, basically, but I did a deep dive on it this week and went back and watched a lot of the big time plays that he would make, what people like about him versus what people don't like about him. And you're right. I think there's a lot of the YOLO ball stuff that you feel like, man, this guy kind of lives and dies by it. I don't know how many of these mistakes he's going to be able to get away with. And with a defensive minded coach like Venables, that's the reason that Jackson Arnold gets benched before halftime of his first career SEC start. It's ball security. And that's going to be, I think, a legitimate question moving forward. And that's not to say that he can't get there, but the range of outcomes with him feels like it's all over the place. If you told me at season's end he's going to be an all SEC quarterback, I'd be like, all right, fine. I could see a path to that. If you told me he's going to get benched for Michael Hawkins Jr. at some point because Venables wants to go with the safer option, I'd be like, yeah, I could probably see that happening too after like consecutive bad games. Where do we land? What does it look like at season's end for Mateer? Does he end up being a guy that totally turns this around? It feels like that's kind of more the direction that you're leaning.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Venables is going to come in, and be like, hey, I need a safer option. He doesn't have the luxury to play it safe this season. Like, that's one angle. Like, he kind of has to go balls to the wall a little bit with this season. Otherwise, he's not getting another one. And at this point, John Mateer gives them a better chance to win than Michael Hawkins, at least from what I saw from Michael Hawkins last year. I mean, they lost the South Carolina game because of Michael Hawkins. Like, he was a young kid. He was in a bad spot. Like, I understand that. I don't want to put it all on a quarterback's shoulders, but they lost that game because of their quarterback. And that's part of the reason that I bring up Venables calling plays for the defense. He's going to be much more focused on the defensive side of the ball. And like before I moved to Illinois, like I was around a coach who was a head coach who spent the majority of his time focused on one side of the football, and the other coordinator got to make his decisions and got to do what he felt was best. And I wonder if, Arbuckle is going to have that that authority and that agency to do what he thinks best. And how much do you compare this to like Diego Pavia, where like there's a little bit of there's quite a bit of like gunslinger in there, and you're probably willing to live with some of the mistakes that are going to come because he's going to ball out, so to speak, and he's going to give you a higher ceiling than what Michael Hawkins gives you.
Kind of a similar skill set. I think definitely different from a build standpoint, what
Sure.
Mateer is going to bring to the table versus Pavia. And it almost felt like Pavia recognized that. And for as much as he gets labeled as this wild card, type of guy, he really was effective in not turning the football over. And that became a huge asset. I think Vandy finished the country number one in turnover margin. And that was a huge, huge piece of why they were able to have the improvement that they did. And I don't know that from a defensive-minded coach standpoint that Venables is going to be on board with every part of this. But you're right. If he's going to give a guy total autonomy, you got to take the good with the bad. Like, you're just going to have to do that. And that's kind of what you've signed up for by going this route. But yeah, I mean, the Pavia comp is going to be, I think, relevant with how much of this migration from Washington State that he's been willing to take on.
Here's the other thing I'll say on the I guess proclivity for turnover worthy plays.
It's a big word there. It's a big
John
word.
Mateer last year, 10.2 yards per target. Like, that was his average depth of target. 9 yards per pass attempt. Jackson Arnold was at 7.9 yards on his targets, and he was at 5.7 yards per play on his pass attempts. So, like, sure, he wasn't turning the football over, but he wasn't giving you opportunities down the field to make explosive plays. And if you're Oklahoma and you look at what you have, I thought a few years ago Bill Bedenbaugh was the best offensive line coach in the country. And I don't really know what's going on with him in recent years because he hasn't been the best offensive line coach in the country, but like, he's still that guy. And they have, I think, 5 of 6 top snap getters back from the offensive line last year. They also have a 5-star tackle that's coming in that they're pretty high on. There's no reason that they shouldn't be at least an average offensive line. John Mateer's ability to run the ball should give you a little bit better pass game. Washington State last season was a 54% run rate team. They were in the top 2 or 3% in the country in terms of early downs EPA, according to Game on Paper. So, like, they were in advantageous spots, and they weren't they weren't living and dying by, Mateer just bombing it deep or Mateer trying to make a play happen. So if you're Oklahoma, like, Oklahoma was 131st in EPA per dropback They were in the 5th percentile in early downs EPA. So they were constantly in situations where Jackson Arnold just wasn't comfortable. If you give Mateer situations where he's comfortable, if you give Mateer situations where he's ahead of the sticks or he's in advantageous positions against defenses, maybe he is a little bit more careful with the football because he knows what he's going against. Or maybe it goes the other way, and maybe you say it doesn't really matter because Oklahoma's defense is pretty good. It doesn't really matter because your turnover-worthy throw came at the opponent's 40-yard line, and it is like the equivalent of like an early punt. Like, it doesn't really matter because you're not turning the ball over 3 or 4 times like in your own 30, like what happened in the South Carolina game. Like, some of these things, the team around him will be better. So I just think the good outweighs the bad with Mateer and his dual threat ability and his ability to create some of those huge explosive plays that were just completely lacking from Oklahoma's offense last year. I think you just have to say, I'm willing to live with, an occasional 2 interception game or something like that if we get such high highs.
So you said top 4, top 5 quarterback in the SEC. Give me one of these guys that you'd take him over. Garrett Nussmeier, DJ Lagway, Lenore Sellers, Arch Manning, Diego Pavia, Nico Iamaleava.
So I actually have your top 10 list pulled up that you
and I left him just outside. I had him as high as 7 at one point, and then I ended up taking Mateer out because of some of the questions that I had, because I thought there were other guys that were more established at this level of competition.
You've got Marcel Reed at 7. I would take Mateer over Reed. This is probably going to be a hot take, but I would take Mateer over Nico.
Tennessee fans will love you for that. Yeah.
If I could take Nico out of, I just didn't understand what Josh Heupel was doing with the kid gloves last year.
Big time kid gloves.
That's part of it. That's a big part of it. I think I would take Mateer over Pavia.
That's one of those that could look way different by season's end too. Yeah. Where we see a month of it and then we feel like we have a much better understanding of that.
Yeah. And so really it's like, like the top 4, I can't really argue with your top 4. You've got Arch Manning 4, you've got Lenore Sellers 3, you've got DJ Lagway 2, you've got Garrett Nussmeier 1. Like, there was a point midway, like towards the end of last season, where I was doing a Heisman watch piece where I was like, hey, this is what, a top 10 Heisman ballot would look like for me if I was doing it right now. I had DJ Lagway as just like a throw-in number 10 for a couple weeks just because of what he was doing for Florida. Like, there's a potential where he's the best quarterback in the SEC and one of the best quarterbacks in the country next year. Garrett Nussmeier went back and forth between this dude could be like a top 15 pick in the NFL draft and dude, what are you doing? Yeah. Lenore Sellers, same thing, awesome quarterback, but then would have throws where he just misses in the dirt. And you're like, dude, what are you doing? You have to make that throw. And then Arch Manning, we've seen Arch be really good against really bad teams or, be really good in pockets where teams were not prepared for him. I'm curious what the potential is obviously undeniable. I'm curious what he does over the course of the season. But so, yeah, I would put Mateer 5th behind that group of 4 that you have. Again, and I would agree with you that he could be 7, he could be 3 by year's end. I don't think he's going to bomb. I'll say that. I don't think he's going to bomb. I don't think he's going to be like a quarterback that you can't win football games with and they have to go to somebody else. I don't envision that happening.
For the sake of Oklahoma fans, I hope he doesn't bomb, because last year was a rough watch. I mean, it was so bad. I couldn't get over the lack of explosive plays and how often it felt like they were just an inevitable 3 and out. And that's a really tough thing to endure as a fan base. Take that from a Chicago Bears fan who knows all too well what it's like to feel better about your defense getting points than your offense. It sucks. It's not fun.
Well, the other thing too is he's going to have a really, really good receiver. Again, assuming health, which I guess is not a safe assumption to make. given what we just saw from OU. But Deion Burks is a really good receiver.
Yes, he is.
And he'll help a ton. And if they get Jaden Gibson back to full health and he's able to give them something, they added 4 receivers in the transfer portal. They added 3 tight ends in the transfer portal. They really went out to try to remake the receiver room. And yes, they lost guys from the receiver room, but those guys didn't provide much last year for one reason or another. So it's hard to be too worried about what they lost. It's hard to get too excited about what they gained. But Deion Burks at least is a really good wide receiver 1 for them, and he'll help.
I think going into year 3 of the Venables era, Oklahoma fans had a legitimate point that, look, he's following the same trajectory as Sark, and compare Sark's year 1 to Venables year 1 and year 2 versus year 2. That's now out the window with the year 3 that Venables had compared to Sark, obviously getting Texas to the playoff in year 3 back in 2023. How far is the gap between Texas and Oklahoma right now?
Oh, I mean, it's pretty wide. Schedule plays a part of that.
It does. It definitely does. If that had been a down to the wire game, it's a little bit of a different story. Instead of this is close for, what was it close for? 25 minutes about, and then all of a sudden it was all she wrote. Texas was not going to let Oklahoma back in the game. If that game is close, I agree. I'm banging that drum a lot more than I probably would be.
The gap is a lot more significant than anybody in Oklahoma ever wants to see the gap between Oklahoma and Texas. And I bring up the schedule a little tongue in cheek. That's a thing. I was not a big believer in Texas down the stretch last season, and I'm not huge on Texas this upcoming season. But it probably doesn't matter because they're probably still going to win 10 games and probably get to the SEC title game just because of the schedule. But Texas had the quarterback spot figured out, and Texas had the offensive line figured out. Oklahoma didn't. Oklahoma pushed all their chips into the Jackson Arnold bucket and just didn't work. We could go back and relitigate the decision to part ways with Dylan Gabriel and begin the Jackson Arnold era. And, I think a lot of coaches would have made the same decision that OU did. And Dylan Gabriel also wanted to be closer to family and play more on the West Coast. So it wasn't like they pushed him out, at least to the extent that a lot of people think happened. But this is what happens when you miss on a quarterback. And then all of the other stuff that happened with OU last year happened. That's what you get. Texas had a really good quarterback in Quinn Ewers. Now, he wasn't an elite quarterback. He wasn't a quarterback that can win you a national championship, but he's a quarterback that can get you to a 12-team playoff. Absolutely. You're making that face at me. We had a conversation. And I'm smiling because I remembered your take on Quinn Ewers going into last season. Yeah. And I felt like, if anything, you were kind of vindicated for having this take that he wasn't a top-tier quarterback. So I'm smiling because you're saying that Texas had the quarterback situation figured out last year with Ewers. Relative to, it's so here's the comparison that I'll make. So I grew up in Oklahoma, obviously. I grew up a Thunder fan. I grew up in the days of Scotty Brooks coaching the Oklahoma City Thunder. And the Thunder moved on from Scotty Brooks as their head coach to Billy Donovan. And then we're up 3-1 on the Golden State Warriors in the Western Conference Finals with a chance to go to the NBA Finals. And that team was better than the team that went to the NBA Finals in 2012. And what I have often argued with people is that Scotty Brooks was the kind of coach that would reset your foundation, give you a super high floor, and build you into a team that could win a title, but he was not a coach that could win a title. And you needed to move on to the next guy that could win you a title. I kind of view Ewers in the same light. I think Quinn was a really good quarterback that could get you to the playoff, but because of some of the warts in his game, he wasn't going to win you a national championship on his own. Maybe Arch Manning is that guy. I don't know. But I didn't think that Quinn Ewers was that guy. At least not a quarterback that could win you a national championship. Now, that has probably changed after, given what we've seen from the 12-team playoff. Like, none of the elite quarterbacks even made the playoff last year, or at least made it to the semifinal round. Like, the quarterbacks in the semifinals last year were average guys.
Not game changers.
Little above average? No, not guys that you would put into a tier of, this guy can go win you a national championship on his own. So maybe that doesn't matter. But that was the way that I viewed Quinn. And, he was certainly better than what Oklahoma had at quarterback. And so I think if you're Texas moving into the new season, like, I wrote a piece like looking at SEC title odds. And at the time at FanDuel, Texas was the odds-on favorite to win the SEC title. And it's hard to argue with anybody that says that Texas can make the SEC championship game. I don't know if Texas can win the SEC championship game. But, they've got quite a few pieces to replace from what was a really good secondary. But like Texas with Arch Manning, CJ Baxter, and Travion Wisner, those are guys that, like, I still don't think Oklahoma has in terms of like elite high level home run hitters. Like, I think Mateer, we just got done talking about it. Like, I think Mateer, like, top quarter of the conference in terms of quarterback play. But Arch has a higher ceiling. Arch has more potential. As a home run hitter, as a game changing playmaker, I would take Arch over Mateer. I think CJ Baxter is awesome.
Me too.
And they missed him last year, and they still had a pretty good, run game late in the season because of it. And they got to replace 4 starters on the offensive line. So we'll see there. But yeah, I mean, I like Texas will be right there again, partially because Sark has recruited really well there, and partially because of the schedule.
Okay, speaking of Arch, friends don't let friends bet on preseason Heisman favorites, trademark pending. Since 2009, and people know this stat, but I have to remind everyone, since 2009, Marcus Mariota is the only preseason top 2 Heisman favorite to win the award. Travis Hunter was 50-1 going into last year, 22nd in those odds. We did our non-quarterback Heisman draft already, so I kind of shared my thoughts on some of the dart throws and who could potentially have that path. Do you have any kind of early leans with the Heisman odds, and who would be the guys that you would say are worth throwing a flyer at?
I do. Let me know who you said first.
Okay, so my draft ended up being, well, I got first pick, so I had Jeremiah Smith. I probably didn't go. I ended up taking Colin Simmons as well. I took Desmond Reed, the Pitt running back, who I compared to Cam Scatterbo, like East Coast Cam Scatterbo. And then I went with Jordan Tyson, the Arizona State receiver. And then who was my 4th pick that I'm bringing? Oh, yeah, I took a dart throw on Cam Coleman as well. So that was what I ended up with. And Will had a much more running back focused draft. And he ended up getting, I'm not going to be able to remember all of these off the top of my head, but he ended up getting Ryan Williams, Nick Singleton. He took Nate Frazier, the Georgia running back as well. And then there's 2 others that Jeremiah Love, of course, was his first pick. And then I'm blanking on who the last one was.
Okay, that's who I was waiting on. Jeremiah Smith is a really good one. He's plus 1,600 at DraftKings right now. I think, one thing that we saw with Travis Hunter last year was that, like, the media narrative sort of took over and really drove that thing. Like, there is no reason that Travis Hunter should have been as overwhelming a favorite as he was late in the season and over those last couple of weeks over Ashton Genty. If you just looked purely at resume and purely at what they were doing. But Travis Hunter, everybody loved him. Which, like, he's an awesome kid, and he was an awesome player, and he was an awesome story. Like, that's fine. But, like, it seems so narrative driven. Everybody loved him and everybody was talking about him. It was constantly like, Travis Hunter's going to win the Heisman. Travis Hunter's going to win the Heisman. This race is over. And I kept wondering, like, it's not over. Like, Colorado's not going to the playoff. Colorado's not playing in the Big 12 championship game. Boise State is playing in its conference title game. Boise State's going to the playoff, assuming it wins its conference title game. Like, why do we assume that it's over? But when you think about it in that light, like Jeremiah Smith could maybe do it because people are just in love with Jeremiah Smith. Like we're just in awe of Jeremiah Smith every single weekend because of how good he was as a true freshman. He was the best wide receiver in the country as a true freshman. And like if people are just as in love with him and he has a monster season, like he probably is in New York City as a Heisman finalist. But Jeremiah Love is the dude. I thought he was the most talented running back that I watched in 2025. He's plus 6,000 at DraftKings right now. Notre Dame is going to have to, figure itself out a little bit on offense early in the season as it moves to a new quarterback, and to have a guy in Jeremiah Love who can break off a 98-yard touchdown run when he's not 100%. He is a highlight waiting to happen. And, like I said, I thought he was the most talented and the most impressive running back that I watched all last season, Janty included.
Wow.
And I think another year, if he's fully healthy, if they give him the opportunity to really have a significant workload, or at least significant enough to where it puts him in that discussion, I think he's a great bet right now as a preseason. I know you don't like betting on the Heisman in the offseason, but I think he's a great
just the favorites.
Value.
Just the favorites. The favorites are the only ones we stay away from. Like, yes, I think if you are going to bet on the Heisman, it is so much more fun to just go, hey, these are my 2 or 3 guys that are 30-1 or worse, and that's just kind of how you roll the dice every year, because just the odds favor that, and there's just so much more value. It's probably a lot more fun to do it that way too, instead of this guy who's going to get picked apart every single week. And yeah, it is a narrative driven award. Like I am a voter. I'm telling you, it is a narrative driven award, and it is part of the entire experience. There absolutely is. And it's almost now, hey, what can you do that we haven't seen before? What are you going to do? Because you can't just be another 1,700-yard rusher or something like that. Like and I'm not saying that's what Ashton Jeanty was, because he obviously was unique chasing Barry Sanders' rushing record, but there is still that element that is always going to exist. And who are the guys that can truly make us say, what you're doing is different? And you're right. Yeah. What Jeremiah Smith can do, even what Jeremiah Love can do with all the hurdles, man. I mean, he's addicted. He's an admitted hurdle addict.
Yeah.
That would be so fun to watch on a weekly basis. How many dudes is he going to hurdle this week?
I would not put it past him to see what Saquon did, jumping over a dude backwards, and him trying that next year. Like, because just watching the playoff and listening to the pregame, then talk about, Jeremiah Love told us he's not going to hurdle anybody this year. And then like 5 minutes into the game, he's jumping over people left and right. Like, this dude is addicted to it. Like you said, he's a hurdle addict. Like, I think he's him and Jeremiah Smith. And then, if we're talking about people at the top of the board, like I think Cade Klubnik deserves some consideration. But friends don't let friends bet on Drew Aller to win the Heisman. I'll tell you that.
Amen. I would not. I would not. At this stage, and it's not just the Notre Dame game. All right, like it's not just the way that ended.
It's all the games, bro. It's all the games. Like,
you gotta have some dudes at receiver that are going to help you out with that case, and I'm still not sold on that yet.
So, do you like Garrett Nussmeier and LSU in 2025? Because I did a thing where I was looking at win totals to sort of target early, and LSU is at 8.5, and I said that I thought there was a little bit of value on an under at 8.5. What do you think of LSU? Because Garrett Nussmeier is obviously a Heisman frontrunner guy. You had him number 1 in your SEC quarterback rankings. Like, what are your thoughts there on them?
If LSU misses the playoff, I'll be stunned. If LSU is not a legitimate national championship contender in year 4 of this no excuses season for Brian Kelly, I will be stunned. He has his ducks in a row in a way that I don't know that he ever even had at Notre Dame. Like that's the part that to me is going to be constant whenever I talk about LSU this offseason, because There really should be no excuses with that defense. It'd be one thing if Harold Perkins was off to the NFL or something like that. It'd be one thing if they were still trying to get the coordinator thing right. You have that. And you had guys that emerged last year in Whit Weeks. Like, your developmental staff is really good. And offensively, if you've got one of the 5 best returning quarterbacks in the sport, you should have a chance. You should be one of those teams. Don't face any of the 3 SEC playoff teams either, too, which is hugely beneficial, even though they have the opener at Clemson. Yeah, I'm bullish on LSU. I'm debating how bullish I'm going to be by the time August rolls around, but as of right now, yeah, like I'm absolutely going to have them in my way too early playoff projections, and I would be looking at the over on that.
Not to completely flip the script on you on your podcast, but I have a follow-up question for you then.
Fire away.
If the buyout wasn't there, would Brian Kelly still be at LSU right now?
Right now, yes. Right now, yes. Yes. The buyout is significant. It's a huge part of this. Still $51 million after this season. He would still be at LSU because guy's 29-11. He had the Heisman season with Jaden Daniels.
And he didn't do anything with, though.
Correct. From a team success standpoint,
arguably the greatest rookie NFL season in history.
Yes.
And a Heisman Trophy winner. And then last year, they get a refereeated win over South Carolina. They have an overtime win over Ole Miss. They lose to a mediocre USC team. I just don't know if I trust Brian Kelly.
I think LSU fans would agree with that. How active they've been at the portal tells me now, as opposed to last year, they're more confident that they should be right there. And that Nick Anderson, guy leaves Oklahoma. Bauer Sharp, guy leaves Oklahoma, goes to LSU. They probably spent a pretty penny on those guys to be able to make that happen in ways that I've questioned with LSU in the past with the portal. I don't know that they've always been able to do that. And I just kind of look at everything in year 4 with him that you could have made excuses in the past. 39 scholarship players in the bowl game. That's what he inherited, right? Every LSU coach in the 21st century has had a national championship by the time they finished year 4. I'm not saying Brian Kelly's joining that club, but the job is always set up for that. Always has been.
Yeah. You're right. There's a lot of potential drama in Baton Rouge next season, and
tons.
They have so much talent, but I'm just curious if Brian Kelly is the guy that can make a situation like that work, where there is so much drama, where there is so much if they lose a Clemson game, it's going to be so loud.
But he does that every year. They're so used to losing season opener games. They're the most used to it.
It's going to be louder, though. The buyout is big. But is it that big in 2025 in the SEC? Is it that big?
Still pretty big.
But is it big enough? Is it big enough to silence how loud the disappointment is going to be if they lose to Clemson, which I think is a possibility.
Oh, if I'm picking right now, I'm probably picking Clemson to win that game. The way that they have started off seasons, they don't have a season opening win in the 2020s. It's one of the most baffling things you can possibly say. LSU has not won a season opening game in the 2020s post national championship, which is just crazy.
And here's a really interesting comparison. I wondered last year if Florida lost to Miami early in the season, if it was going to derail things and really spell the end for Billy Napier. And they got blown out, and then they lost A&M, and it looked like it was trending in the wrong direction. And then Billy Napier really righted the ship and galvanized the team, and they closed strong. Do you think Brian Kelly could have done that same job
at Florida? I don't know that he would have been set up as much for success. Now, I would also argue, I don't know if he ever would have been in that situation where he's getting trucked like that at home. That's typically not been his MO. Yes, last year you get trucked by Bama, a Bama team that came in and just did everything that LSU was not built to handle at that point in the season. But But you're right. Like it is going to be a question of, hey, he's never really been in that spot. And to his credit, he's never really been in that spot. Can he navigate that if all of a sudden it feels like the walls are closing in and his face is just redder and redder every single week? It'll absolutely be a question in Baton Rouge if that second loss hits. Again, I don't know that losing to Clemson is going to all of a sudden be the sign that the sky is falling when LSU fans at this point are just so used to it.
That's fair.
Derek, great stuff, man. Do this again real soon.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's close with some lad of the week. Will, we're going to be doing a couple of different things. We're in the lab trying to cook up some user-friendly user engagement segments at the end that I think we're going to be able to incorporate throughout the offseason as well. Pitch Me is going to be coming back at some point here in the near future, and then we're going to have some other ideas as well. Lad of the week for now. We will at some point kind of roll out what those plans look like, by the way. And I should have probably said at the top, the one day that we are going to be coming out with pods will be Thursday mornings in the offseason. We'll be recording on Wednesday. I should have mentioned that at the top. So a little housekeeping there.
Look, that's how you know he's a podcaster now. He's burying the lead, folks.
I buried the crap out of that lead. I really did. Big time. All right, lad of the week. Who you got?
Okay, so I got a couple. I have a nod to the sombrero ground lizard, who is facing extinction at a small island in the Caribbean. They have now come back. They've seen a 1,500% increase in population. So welcome back, sombrero ground lizard.
Love it.
On to the actual lad of the week. It is Michael Jordan, but for not for the reason that you'd think. Michael Jordan this week opened the Michael Jordan Family Medical Clinic, which is his fourth hospital that he has opened. This one is in his hometown of Wilmington, North Carolina. And it's aimed at helping kids or people who are uninsured and kind of on the lower end of the income spectrum. And one thing about MJ is he's actually not in his older life, I think, been like crazy about the public eye. I think he just kind of wants to go do his thing.
He's never been crazy about it.
Yeah, I think that he just kind of, and we can talk about his fashion choice or whatever, but he just kind of is a cool guy, and so people like flock to him. But I don't think he does any of the big PR stuff the way that the current face of the NBA does, who shall remain nameless. And this is actually a pretty good example of that because he is out here actually making real change in the world, and I want to tip of the cap there because there's plenty of worse things you can do as a billionaire, as we've seen.
Yeah, and after maybe not the best week of PR for his family, I guess that was 2 weeks ago that happened. You can Google if you know what I'm talking about. Certain arrests that happened, actually not that far from where I live, and I was trying to figure out because I saw the arrest video of it, and I was like, do I go by those train tracks that often? Like, how exactly did that unfold? But yes, MJ doing great thing. Look, never going to push back on MJ for lad of the week. That's evergreen. Mine's Bruce Pearl. I am someone who has a different perspective of Bruce Pearl because I think if you were raised in the Midwest, he is received much differently in the Midwest, in the Big Ten area of the country than the SEC. Just who he was known as before he went to Tennessee and kind of the NCAA behind the scenes stuff that he was involved in. Just there's a very different perception of Bruce Pearl. And the one that he's embraced at Auburn, look, I am not going to poke holes in or anything like that, but becomes the first coach to ever win 1-2 matchups at two different schools. That atmosphere looked unbelievable in Tuscaloosa, and even though the home team doesn't end up winning it, still just a monumental day for SEC basketball. I know it's a football podcast. We talk about some basketball stuff in the lad of the week, but the way that this is all unfolded for Bruce Pearl, the team that just got embarrassed and was a laughingstock in that game against Yale, and now everybody will be asking, are they going to do the Virginia? And it's different because obviously Auburn wasn't the 1 seed. They were a 4 seed. They probably should have been a 2 or a 3 because they were 5 in net ranking. They were top 5 in Ken Palm. They won the SEC tournament. But the way that this has all unfolded for them, they got something cooking that feels very special. And in this day and age of college basketball, with the way that the portal sets up and how hard it is to feel attached to specific teams, I know that Auburn fans right now are just soaking in every bit of this. And to win a game like they did on Saturday, even with, Chani Broom missing a whole lot of free throws down the stretch, the Baker Mazzara, that slap that he had at the end of that game, you're just like, dude, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. That was first round of the NCAA tournament all over again. But yeah, the way that Auburn has continued to just show that it is in a different place and it is not going to go into some sort of a tailspin. It feels title or bust in a whole lot of ways for Bruce Pearl. Will the SEC win its first basketball national title since 2012? If not now, then when?
That would be actually the funniest outcome of this season, where the Big Ten, again, I'm dumping on the Big Ten a lot this pod, I apologize, but the Big Ten spent all this time going, it's not just about football, it's about academics, it's about basketball, it's about golf. And then the Big Ten gets good at football and they go, it's just about football. And then the SEC comes right
Yep.
behind them and they go, actually, oh, I thought it was about basketball. Hold on, we got baseball. What do you want?
Gymnastics too, man. Don't sleep on that. Yeah. Look, I was looking at the bracketology, the Joe Lunardi bracketology. 14 ICC teams projected in. Record's 11. Big East had 11 back in 2011. And say what you will about expanded conferences, maybe that's going to take away from the feat itself moving forward. But golly, I mean, seeing 3 SEC teams show up on that 1 seed line with the mock show. Yeah, this feels very much like a special year, and Auburn could be the most special of them all, especially if they play the way that they did on Saturday night in Tuscaloosa.
Real quick on Bruce Pearl, I was like, what did he do in the mid? Because this man got the Tennessee job in 2005. I was a wee lad back then. Did not know he was at Milwaukee and Southern Indiana before then. So he's actually spent more of his career up north than down here.
His time as an assistant as well before that was what I was getting to. Illinois fans, maybe not the biggest Bruce Pearl fans. Won't be rooting for him this March. Anyways, like I said at the top, we are doing some different things with the show, but what would really, really mean a lot, leave us a 5-star review. Please comment why you like the show, how long you've been rocking with us, anything that we could do to make the show better. Honestly, we would love for criticism like that. Be nice. Don't be too mean. My ears are big. I get it. My ears are big. You can poke fun at that. That's fine. I'm a man. I can take it. But please leave us a 5-star review if you have not. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch every single episode of the Saturday Down South podcast. Follow us on Twitter at the SDS Pod, at South Down South, at CJ Guerrero, at Chris Hart. Thanks, guys. Talk soon.